If you're a fan of horror, I don't think I have to tell you that John Carpenter's The Thing is one of the best horror films ever made. And I probably don't have to tell you that when it was released in 1982, it was met with poor reviews and box office disappointment that essentially derailed Carpenter's career for years, only for massive reappraisement in the decades that followed to elevate its reputation in the genre. And you probably already know about the 2011 prequel also titled The Thing, which is sorta not talked about these days after hasty CGI special effects left fans disappointed. But did you know that we came insanely close to getting a true sequel to John Carpenter's film back in 2005, in the form of a two-part miniseries titled Return of the Thing? Set to be directed by Frank Darabont, best known for The Shawshank Redemption and launching The Walking Dead, and with a completed script by David Leslie Johnson-McGoldrick, who went on to write for The Walking Dead and Aquaman, Return of the Thing would have brought back fan favorites and new monsters in a story that gave definitive answers to Carpenter's haunting, open-ended conclusion. But what happened to cause this Sci-Fi Network miniseries to never be made? And could this sequel have ever measured up to the original? Come with me as we journey back to Outpost 31 and witness the return of the Thing. If you've been following my channel for a while, then you probably already know that I'm not just a big fan of The Thing, but the works of John Carpenter in general. And seeing as I've already done 2 videos on The Thing, including one on John Carpenter's Apocalypse trilogy last year, I'll keep the movie recap to a brief. What you really need to know is that Carpenter's film for Universal Pictures was a loose adaptation of the 1938 John W. Campbell novella Who Goes There, and was written by Bill Lancaster. Of course, there was already an adaptation of it titled The Thing from Another World in 1951 that Carpenter was a fan of, but they really have no relation beyond source material. And in Carpenter's The Thing, a group of researchers in Antarctica fight to survive when their isolated group is infiltrated by an alien creature that can absorb and replicate any living being. By the end of the movie, our only survivors are pilot R.J. MacReady, played by the GOAT, Kurt Russell, and Mechanic Childs, played by another fucking GOAT, Keith David. The Thing has been seemingly destroyed, the base has been blown up, and the 2 men sit in freezing temperatures, waiting to either die or be exposed as an alien. It's a bleak, inconclusive ending, but that's what makes it so good. And in the decades since, as The Thing was reclaimed by horror fans, Carpenter has said he knows the true answers about who is or isn't a thing, but refuses to say. And I think that's really for the best. We don't need answers to make a story good, when the lack of them elevates the narrative. There were also quite a few comics telling new stories in this world, a video game sequel in 2002 that was recently remastered, and that 2011 prequel I've mentioned. And this leads us to our Unmade miniseries. Frank Darabont began to make a name for himself in the 80s writing the scripts for A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and The Blob, both directed by writing partner Chuck Russell, as well as for The Fly 2 before really breaking through as a director with The Shawshank Redemption in 1994 and The Green Mile in 1999 and founding Darkwoods Productions. And it was during that time that David Leslie Johnson-McGoldrick began working with Darabont as a production assistant while hoping to break through as a screenwriter. That opportunity came in the early 2000s when the still not sillily spelled Sci-Fi Channel put out a call for screenwriters to pen a new take on The Thing. This was right around the time when the channel was starting to find some success with its original movies, and Johnson-McGoldrick and Darkwoods Productions were hired to write the script. The pitch that I was hearing is that they wanted a reinvention, said Johnson-McGoldrick. They were like, take the source material, turn it into something else. It's no connection to the John Carpenter movie. It was remade once, we'll remake it again. Make the creature something different. Make it so that it can turn into any kind of object. It was really blue sky at the time. Of course, by this point, Carpenter's film and special effects artist Rob Bottin's creature designs had become iconic to the point that not staying in line with them would have angered fans. According to McGoldrick, I pitched them that this was the equivalent of trying to reimagine the Xenomorph or trying to reimagine the Predator. They saw the value in retaining that initial iconic imagery and iconic story. And at last we come to the script for Return of the Thing, a 2-part, 2-night event miniseries that would be a true sequel to Carpenter's original and a backdoor pilot for an ongoing TV series if it succeeded. Okay, enough with the background, let's get on to the movie. In the first draft of the script, dated February 11th, 2005, Part 1 of Return of the Thing, subtitled Exposure, opens with the last moments of Carpenter's movie to remind us of what happened, before smash cutting to 6 months later and showing us MacReady and Childs both frozen dead in the snow. It's a real shining moment, and I hate it. I love that the thing ends with such a downbeat and likely inescapable ending, but I don't need to see my guys turn into popsicles. This scene is immediately discovered by a Soviet military team including Dr. Yuri Lukyanov and his wife Alina. And we know that they're geniuses immediately because they're playing a game of chess against one another that's only in their heads. A sort of nod to MacReady's game against the computer. It's a major military operation complete with armed forces and 2 Hindees. Excuse me, Hindees. Here to find out what happened before any Americans or Norwegians do. The Soviets have also found the spaceship in the snow and enter it only 7 pages in, before we're hit with a title card and jump to, god dang it, 23 years later? We pick up in Moscow with Yuri Lukyanov now in his 60s and haunted by his experiences. We quickly find out a man named Ivan Vitsenko was able to flee the country and fly to the US. And while the film plays coy, it's clear that Vitsenko is a thing, and once he lands, the creature will unstoppably spread, with Lukyanov heading to America to stop it. From there, we meet Roger Pritchard, a US government agent working to intercept Vitsenko, as the Russians have tipped them off about the man, only saying he's carrying weaponized smallpox. The military is able to reroute the plane to Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico, while Vitsenko transforms into a thing on board in a copy of the unforgettable defibrillator sequence, eventually causing the passenger plane to crash in New Mexico, similar to the spaceship's Antarctic crash, just outside of Navajo man Frank Littlebear's ranch, leading to another echo as a fleshy thing flower grabs and copies a nearby coyote to escape. Beyond the crash site, Return of the Thing carries on with Lukyanov's travel to the US with the Federal Security Services agent Petrovsky, while Pritchard and his boss, Department of Homeland Security agent Pete Avery, set up a quarantine zone using a conveniently close-by abandoned military base. And from here, we're introduced to a surprisingly big cast of characters in the town of Christmas, New Mexico. Population 318. There's county utility worker Rafferty, Sheriff Len Hayes, 8-year-old Michael Elliott and his mom Sarah Elliott in her 20s, Bob Boyle in his 40s and gruff, wife Samantha, 10 years younger and Sarah's sister, and volunteer firefighters Maureen, Jamie Prescott, and Billy, who respond to the crash before the government can quarantine it and find a gruesome scene, with burned bodies hanging upside down in seats and one badly scorched survivor. The firefighters are soon surrounded by a massive military unit with Black Hawk helicopters, and the narrative quickly splits into many different subplots, both in and out of the tiny town. In Homeland Security Headquarters, Dr. Ann Blackburn, Chief of Special Pathogens at CDC, finds out that Lukyanov was a specialist in disease manufacturing, not control, and disappeared in 1984. At the Atomic Bar and Grill, where Sarah works as a waitress, U.S. Marshal Mitch Brenner is in town transporting a prisoner, Hollis Gates. On board the Russian jet, Agent Petrovsky decides to abort the mission when he finds out the plane crashed, only for Lukyanov to shoot him dead and hijack the jet. The coyote is on its way to Christmas, infecting a jackrabbit and leading to a scene with a young girl named Ginny surrounded by many creepy rabbits, while Little Bear tracks the coyote, calling it a skinwalker that must be killed, which is kinda true. All the while, the military quarantines the entire area, as an epidemic intelligence service team finds the burned and twisted remains of a thing with 3 faces. It's about halfway into part 1 when we finally get some really gruesome stuff, a dissection of the thing like in Carpenter's film, and a really unconventional and gross surprise in the diner as owner Luis makes food using eggs from a chicken coop the coyote got into. He cracks another egg in the pan. The instant the yolk hits the hot pan, it screams and seems to turn inside out, blossoming with tiny tentacles and pincers. Luis screams too, stumbling back against the counter and falling on his ass. The egg thing shrieks at him like fingernails on a chalkboard, then frantically slithers out of the pan, away from Luis, and drops behind the oven, out of sight. A moment later, it's like nothing even happened. Luis sits frozen, trying to catch his breath. Shiner, one hand still on his coffee, looks at the pan with wide, startled eyes. Something wrong with your eggs. Soon the crawling egg thing attacks the customer and begins to absorb him, as the rest of the eggs burst open and turn into a spidery mass. Shot by Luis's shotgun, they splatter all over him and begin to bore into his skin, just in time for a commercial break.
Who's brave enough to play Ghost Castle? The victim's journey room by room. They take their chances. Along the way, anything can happen, and usually does. To win, you must reach the coffin and lay the ghost. Will anybody survive Ghost Castle from NB Games?
The Marshal is soon attacked, leaving Gates to free himself while Rafferty is approached by the Coyote. But most importantly, the Thing corpse in the morgue sneaks up on a character in a hazmat suit. We really haven't had any mystery around who is or isn't a Thing so far, so this finally gives us some surprises because we don't know who's in the suit. With Lukanov saying that everything that might be infected needs to be burned, the Alpha Thing Coyote being electrocuted on a fence, which causes it to transform but still survive, and Sarah inviting boyfriend Rafferty over for dinner, revealing to Michael that they're getting married. The first really effective surprise comes when Rafferty, who's been acting extremely sus the entire time he's been visiting, proposes to Sarah, completely upending what we expected, only for Sarah to suddenly transform in a grotesque scene. Suddenly, the skin of Sarah's ring finger peels back and a barbed tendril shoots out of it, stabbing him in the chest. Rafferty gasps in pain and surprise. Michael's eyes go wide and his mouth opens in a silent scream. More tendrils come whipping out of Sarah, plugging into Rafferty like he was a telephone switchboard. Sarah glares at him, her eyes bulging until they pop out of their sockets, rising on weird snake-like stalks. Her jaw drops until it hangs down to her chest. Then she leans over and starts swallowing Rafferty whole like a boa constrictor. Her whole body distends as it slowly engulfs him. Rafferty's muffled screams can be heard from inside her. Michael watches in paralyzed horror. Young Michael is able to escape to Bob and Samantha as the entire town soon descends into chaos, in a cool moment when one of the Things lets out that howl you hear in the original, and it's joined by many other howls across town, with the film cutting between characters reacting and the viewer realizing how quickly the situation is spiraling out of control. It's barely only the first night after the plane crash here, leading to Sarah revealing herself and attacking the family, who are saved by Little Bear. From there, Lukanov, who has joined our government team in their mobile lab, gives us a flashback to the Antarctic prologue, and we finally go inside the ship. Lukanov says the ship had been buried in the ice for 100,000 years, and inside they find an alien corpse and an 8-foot-tall transparent chamber that was housing something that broke out and destroyed the ship. Some frozen blood samples are taken, and that's the origin of this new outbreak. MacReady and Child's bodies are also autopsied. Come on man, don't do this to Kurt. And we finally get a definitive answer that neither MacReady nor Childs were Things at the end of Carpenter's movie. Of course, John may have something different to say about that. Soon, the Soviet government pushes Lukanov and his wife to turn it into a weapon, trying to train the Thing to be a guided smart virus with genetic memory. Of course, this ends badly as Alina is infected, forcing Lukanov to burn her alive. Decades later, the single remaining vial of Thing juice was stolen by Chechen rebels who thought it was smallpox, causing our current predicament. Back in the present, Lukanov, knowing that if the Thing escapes, the entire world will be infected in just over 3 years, urges the military to drop a nuclear bomb on the town. With the full stakes of what's happening fully realized, we have a montage of Gates holding up Little Bear before he restarts his hunt of the Coyote, Lukanov realizing the outbreak in Christmas has begun, the crash survivor who is not infected waking up, and our military characters arriving in the town to see it on fire and filled with chaos and death. And with that, part 1 of Return of the Thing comes to a close. So as you can see from part 1 and what will come in part 2, Return of the Thing is a really massive sequel. We do have some isolation because of the town being a tiny place in the desert, but it's already so much bigger in scope than the first one. And with that comes the challenges of keeping this still somewhat containable. It's just that a desert still has so much more life than Antarctica, so the suspension of disbelief just becomes harder and harder. It also has a lot more story arcs it's trying to balance, which is meant to fill out the 4-hour runtime, but not all of them are as interesting as the others. While I like Lukanov's story as essentially the Dr. Loomis of this film, most of the other government characters are pretty dry. Avery and Pritchard's conflict, with them selling each other out over who gets to be in charge, is pretty boring and neither has many distinctive characteristics. Really, I find myself wanting to be back in the town for most of this first part, as characters like Gates and Little Bear are much more interesting and have more exciting things to do. Although I think part 2 makes the government lab stuff more exciting. But what about the monsters that we're all here for? As the unfortunate 2011 prequel shows us, a new version of the thing that is trying to live up to Carpenter and Botine's work needs great special effects. Thankfully, Sci-Fi tapped K&B Effects Group co-founder Greg Nicotero to create Return of the Thing's creatures. By this point, Nicotero was already responsible for some fantastic horror effects, and was already good friends with Darabont, having worked on The Green Mile to help make me very sad. The script goes into great detail about how these things change and morph, with lots of tentacles, claws, spider legs, and flesh petals, in line with Botine's original design. I just wish there were more new takes of the thing, as it often leans on what we saw before. And as you'll soon see, the chaos of the film's climax will give us plenty of opportunities for new monsters. Part 2 of Return of the Thing, subtitled Extreme Amplification, has its first draft dated October 7th, 2005, and begins with the military and our scientists moving to the town of Christmas, which has been destroyed overnight with plenty of dead bodies due to townsfolk killing each other. Avery and Pritchard, who have turned on each other during the escalating investigation, are at each other's throats, as Pritchard takes Avery's jacket and starts cutting holes in it, hiding it to frame him as the thing. The ripped-up hazmat suit from the earlier attack has been found, and rescue squads are sent into Christmas to find survivors, taking in dozens including Bob, Samantha, Jamie, Wendy, Taylor, and Sheriff Hayes, and placing them in a quarantined hall. Meanwhile, Little Bear fights Gates and ties him up, only to be joined by Luis, who has been shot. Despite Gates' warning, Little Bear tries to treat him. He wipes the wound clean, clearing the blood. Luis cringes in pain. Little Bear leans in a little closer. Suddenly, inside the bullet hole, a yellow coyote's eye opens and stares up at him. Stunned, Little Bear jerks back and looks up at Luis's face. Luis is staring at him, grinning, grin growing wider and wider, past human proportions. Teeth distending like daggers and biting right through the thick leather belt as if it were tissue paper. Little Bear cries out, reeling back and falling on his ass. He yanks his pistol, fires a shot into Luis. Luis takes the bullet hit and begins convulsing on the cot, gagging and jerking. Little Bear scuttles back, firing bullets into him. They're able to escape and blow up the rapidly shifting monster in a very cool scene that homages the 50s film. There's also plenty of homages to Carpenter's film directly called out in the script, including a helicopter chasing a coyote. How well these would have been done is all a matter of how well the film would have been made. Soon, an encounter with Rafferty Thing, who has snuck into the survivor camp, forces everyone to fully believe Lukanov and the need for a nuke. It also highlights how impossible this situation is, and why Carpenter and Lancaster kept their film in such a small location, before it could spiral out of hand and make audiences ask too many questions. I don't believe you grasp the magnitude of what we're dealing with here. Until now, I didn't either. Not fully. The human body isn't just comprised of cells, it's home to billions of microorganisms. If someone has a cold when they're infected, chances are this thing won't just imitate the person, it'll imitate the cold virus too. So now it's airborne. One sneeze contains millions of bacteria, and we have to account for every one of them, because a single cell is all it takes to pass the infection on. As squads discover infected townsfolk stripping cars for parts and disappearing underground, we essentially have 3 plot threads as the government begins a 10-hour countdown to dropping the nuclear bomb. At the government lab, Avery's torn-up coat is found, causing him to be locked up and for the group to question if the hot wire test is still working, or if the things have adapted to it. While Pritchard attempts to escape the quarantined lab, Lukanov and Blackburn find a new test, electrocuting the sample to cause an involuntary reaction inspired by the defibrillator attack. Eventually, Pritchard admits to the captive Avery that he framed him, but then we find out that Avery really is a thing, exposed by the electricity test in a pretty cool double-turn reveal, as Avery melts Pritchard with goo and rips him apart. Lukanov and Blackburn manage to kill it by setting off the sprinklers and electrocuting it with the wet floor. Little Bear and Gates hunt the coyote, tracking it to a canyon where it infects a pack. leading to a big Molotov and exploding arrow action scene that eventually causes them to fall into an underground cavern, chasing the Alpha Thing Coyote and discovering that the town sits on top of an old Cold War nuclear base, where all the infected are gathering. Gates and a wounded Little Bear are separated in the base, with Gates finding his way out and promising to come back. And the survivor hall is gripped with paranoia. First they want to tie up little Michael, then they attack Bob, and finally they turn on leader Harold and mob him. Sheriff Hayes and Samantha get young boys Taylor and Michael out a broken window as the townspeople and soldiers fight, caused by Bob holding one hostage. However, Taylor is a thing and tricks Michael into falling into the underground tunnel where his thing mom is trying to catch him. Gates saves him, and they're in turn saved by military flamethrower troops. On a live feed to the president, Lukanov and Blackburn electrocute the Pritchard thing, causing it to revert to past forms, including characters from the Carpenter movie and Lukanov's wife, Alina. Eventually, it regresses to an insect-like alien that reveals their ship collected life samples from different planets and accidentally took in a thing-infected one, leading to the crash. From there, it regresses to its purest form, a dark whirlpool of flesh and blood before exploding. And here's where we get our big climax. Gates leads the squad underground with Lukanov to destroy the things, only to find 300 of them creating dozens of little silver flying saucers. From there, a big confrontation with the group reveals that Little Bear is now one of them and acting as a leader, which is kinda disappointing. I like that character and he gets done dirty here, leading to a massive battle between soldiers and a rapidly transforming group, with the script describing the scene as a small-town Norman Rockwell mob as reinterpreted by William Blake on a trip to hell, sprouting barbed crab-like appendages that shred, tear, impale. Meanwhile, the survivor hall is retested, showing that only 16 of the survivors in the camp were human, with the rest torched, including Sheriff Hayes. A cool reveal, but it kinda undercuts what we've invested into that group. Eventually, back at the big battle, we get a spiderhead stampede, all jumping into saucers and trying to escape as they've opened the missile silo, which the soldiers fight to close. Bob, Samantha, and Michael, still human, are rescued in a Black Hawk as Lukanov shuts the silo doors and destroys almost all of the saucers, then blows himself and the control room up with an explosive satchel. The rest of the things are destroyed with thermobaric explosives as Gates and a few soldiers escape and reach Blackburn and the plane. However, one saucer escapes, and we're left wondering if it gets out of range of the nuclear explosion like our survivors. Jumping ahead weeks later, Blackburn debriefs the government about what happened, and wonders if something made it out alive as we push into a bustling New York City, all while reflecting that it would only be 3 years until the end of the world if it did. Through a series of long lens shots, we move in on one of the insanely crowded streets choked with pedestrians. Seething masses of humanity flow before our eyes. Closer and closer we come until our senses are filled with people and motion. But there's one man just standing there, his back to us, motionless as a rock in the middle of a river. 27,000 hours, and counting. The man turns and we see his face. It's Little Bear. He starts to walk, disappearing into the flow of humanity. Gone. The end. It's a really dark ending. In fact, way darker than the ending of Carpenter's film, which was ambiguous but still had hope of ending the infection. Of course, it also sets up sequels or an ongoing series. But who would it star? One of the weaknesses I find in Return of the Thing is that beyond Lukanov, we don't really have a central character, and none are as interesting as MacReady. But obviously, that was never made. So what happened? This thing would have been crazy expensive. This is the Aliens to the original's Alien, full of soldiers, families, and big action set pieces. Massive sets, a huge amount of practical effects, a big cast, and a scope that was way bigger than what Carpenter ever got to work with. This would have been a huge theatrical film, and would probably work better rewritten into a 2.5-hour feature, but instead it was supposed to be a TV movie in the early 2000s. That alone put the project on hold. Then Universal decided to hop aboard the remake bandwagon happening around the time with movies like Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street, and you wind up with the 2011 prequel. Universal simply had no interest putting the thing on TV. I always felt like they could have coexisted, said Johnson-McGoldrick. The prequel goes back in time and we go forward, and they don't conflict with each other in any way. I remember when I finally saw the prequel, at the very end, they mentioned that there's a Russian base nearby, and I was like, it's perfect. We dovetail exactly with where we want to be. They just set up the Russian base that's going to come and find this stuff in our movie, but it just wasn't meant to be. However, in the early 2020s, the idea was revisited, this time with Johnson-McGoldrick and NBC Universal turning it into an ongoing TV series. The series that we had in mind was Blair's Countdown from the movie. If this thing ever got to the general population, this is how long it would take for the entire world to be assimilated. Our idea was, what if the entire series was that countdown? The thing wins in the end. You get to season 5 or whatever and it's done. But the whole time, we're set on Blair's timeline and we're just counting down until the end. Pretty bleak. NBC didn't go for that. As for the people involved, Darabont, Nicotero, and Johnson-McGoldrick would all finally fulfill their wish to create horror for TV with the launch of The Walking Dead in 2010. But while that show quickly became a ratings juggernaut and is somehow still shambling around like it's zombies, Darabont was fired during season 2 and went on to sue AMC. It's a big mess I'm not going to get into, but post-Walking Dead, Darabont has barely done anything besides a short-lived show and uncredited screenplay work. It's a real shame because with his work on films like Dream Warriors, The Blob, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and The Mist, Darabont is a low-key MVP of horror. And as mentioned, The Thing did get another film made with the 2011 prequel, which was, like the original, a financial disappointment, causing that film to also have a scrapped sequel plan that would have followed Mary Elizabeth Winstead's Kate fight another Thing outbreak on an oil rig. Every few years, it seems like creators and studios get interested in making a new Thing movie, but it rarely goes anywhere. Back in 2023, Carpenter himself said that a new sequel to The Thing was possibly being developed, but he couldn't say any more than that. And with nothing else said, who knows what may happen. If a true sequel to The Thing ever does come to pass, I'd be interested to see how it plays out, but I can't say if it's actually a good idea. Because, like an alien set to take over the world, some things are better left frozen in the past. Thanks for watching today's video, and I'm back covering yet another unmade sequel to a classic. Honestly, I just really love making these types of videos, and with people recently really enjoying my coverage of Steven Spielberg's Night Skies, I thought, why not make another one? And as I mentioned in the video, and as you probably already know, I am a huge fan of John Carpenter and The Thing. While The Thing probably isn't my favorite Carpenter, that's probably Big Trouble in Little China, it's an amazing movie and is beloved by so many people now. Just about 40 years too late. And in my research into the movie last year when I was talking about Carpenter's Apocalypse trilogy, I learned more about Return of the Thing, so I put it into my very long list of video ideas and waited for the right time to do it. And I thought, hey, why not do it now? This is a wild story, and obviously it didn't get made because this would have been way too expensive for the Sci-Fi Channel. But I think it's pretty good. There's a lot that could be trimmed and tightened up, and I really think this would still work better as a feature film instead of a 2-part miniseries, but there's a lot I like about it. Exchanging a frozen setting for a desert one makes sense if you want to change things up a bit, but I think that adds a lot of logistical questions to the nature of the Thing and how realistically anyone could actually stop it once it gets in some other location. Still, I think this is a great, big, Aliens-esque, action-heavy sequel to that awesome movie. Would it have lived up to it? It's hard to say. Probably nothing ever will. Although I am interested in seeing what sequel is apparently being cooked up, but I think people still would have enjoyed this movie if it was done just right. And with Frank Darabont possibly directing it, I think it would have been in good hands. This is, after all, the first draft that I'm reading from here, and it's already pretty strong as it is. If you would like to read it, I will link it below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this unmade sequel, what other unmade sequels you'd like for me to cover on the channel, and what, if anything, you'd like to see done with The Thing in the future. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons and members for their continued support. And if you'd like to be a patron or member, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video and exclusive reviews, with the latest one being a review of the Back to the Future trilogy. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and watching the skies.